ashes of his father still in the trunk of the car because he has yet to come to grips with this and figure out what to do with them. So that's kind of a thing that has been going on for a while. And then there's his harridan of a mother who is very much alive and usually pestering him with annoying phone calls on his cell phone while he's driving around on the Cape dealing with what's going on. And then you flash forward a year in the story, and another wedding is taking place, and this time it's their daughter, Laura, only the wedding is taking place in Maine. And other things have happened, which is that now he's carting his mother around in the trunk of the car as well, because she has since passed away, and he's gotten no closer to resolving all of these outstanding issues with his parents. So he's got the weight of his parents had a very difficult marriage, and he's got the weight of that to process, and that, of course, brings up all of the issues in his own marriage, which is failing. And in most really good character studies, and this is one of them, I think you see a lot of the characters' problems where the past and the present are kind of fighting for dominance and working themselves out at the same time. So this book is all about those kinds of relationships. It's the whole thing. It's a family saga, really, but it focuses on Griffin, and he's the one who's carrying around, in a sense, literally, the emotional baggage and trying to figure out what to do with it. But Russo is more than just a good character writer. He's really, he's poignant, but he's also hysterically funny at times. And I think if you've read any of them, particularly Straight Man, which is another one that I think is really good at that. Life is funny, and he really has a very good way of bringing that out. But this is not a depressing book. It's a mix of poignant and bittersweet, but also funny, and reflective and introspective at the same time. But he's really wry and he's really witty. And actually, at the end, there's some sort of culminating events which I can't tell you about, but they'll have you snorting your iced tea out your nose, because they're just laugh out loud funny at the end of the story. Yeah.
So what about the Cape? Is it a character? Is it?
Yes and no. That's actually a good question, because much of the action takes place on the Cape, but in a sense, Russo could have set this story anywhere. I think he chose the Cape partly because it has a strong personality as a place, and he knows it so well. So if you are familiar with Cape Cod, this is a very believable part of the story. It doesn't rise quite to the level of character, but I think what's important about it, the thing that struck me the most is that in the book, all of the family characters, they revolve around Cape Cod, but none of them ever actually lived there, so they have a different perspective on it. They spent time there, they visited there, they all come together there once a year. So it's different from a place that you live. They have a different relationship with this place, but it's still very important that it be the Cape, because it's the place they all come back to for solace and resolution in some way. So in that sense, the Cape is very much present in the story. So that's that Old Cape Magic by Richard Russo.
Great. It's almost like it's a mythic place.
It is. Yeah. So, Leanne, what do you have for us?
Well, my first list is called Stunning Stories, and I've done this for a few years now, where it's a hodgepodge of genres, authors, kinds of different books. The thing that probably really ties them together is, of course, my hook, which is characters. Characters that I want to get to know better, characters that lead me through the book as I read it. So this particular book, which is by Heather O'Neill, is called The Lonely Hearts Hotel. It's a very quirky gem of a story. The language is gorgeous, the setting is atmospheric and seductive, and the characters, which again is always my hook, completely mesmerized me. I could not get enough of them, even the awful ones. It's a little weird, making it very hard to categorize. It's a hypnotic line between tragedy and fairy tale, I would say. It was a lot of fun, and at times it found me smiling at very odd moments because of the writing and the way the characters would come together. It takes the very worn theme of star-crossed love between two orphans, and it sort of takes your expectations and turns it on your head, which is another thing I like about a writer. It's original and an unforgettable story. It's set in Montreal and New York City for a time, but mostly in Montreal between World War I and World War II during the Depression. It's a spellbinding story. And again, there's two orphans. They're both gifted, and they fall in love with each other at very early ages. They're really, really young. And they have a very unusual magnetism and talent that allows them to sort of imagine the sensational future that they're probably going to have and they're going to have together. The beginning of the book contains magical realism with a very bleak and ugly existence that sort of makes you wonder why you keep on reading. But you do, and one of the reasons you do is because you know that these two have got to be together and you've got to have something of a good ending. Now there's alternative side-by-side narratives that you sort of hear about as they get into their teenage years. They're pushed apart. And you hear about their very impoverished and I'd say very depraved existences to get from one point to the other. But then you just keep rooting for that happy ending that you know has to keep coming. You know it has to be there.
You hope.
I think that this is very reminiscent of Morgenstern's The Night Circus, which is a really hard book to do as a reader's advisory librarian because she's a wonderful writer and it's so unique. And I think that The Lonely Hearts Hotel is very unique as well. One of the things I think they have in common is that they're character-driven stories with touches of magic in the story, very magical moments. Now this author, O'Neill, fills this brilliant tragic comedy, I would call, with shady characters and allows you to step into the minds of children, prostitutes, gangsters, circus performers, and everyone else existing in this very dismal Great Depression. Now I have to say, speaking of circus performers, that there are a lot of clowns in this book. For me, that was initially problematic.
We know how you feel about clowns.
I have a problem with clowns. It goes back to my childhood. There's no reason to go into that. But the point is that what this book allowed me to do is see a variety of different clowns, men and women, I might add, as really, there's a philosophical reason for their being. They are both philosophers, wise men and women, and they express the beauty and sadness of the human condition in a way that nothing else does. And there are a lot of clowns in this book, let me tell you. Another comparison between The Night Circus and The Lonely Hearts Hotel is the writing. There are nearly too many clever similes. I'll give you an example. Horses' hooves sounded like a room full of children with hiccups.
I love that.
And the other one I really liked was their laughter was like a pheasant that burst out of a thicket. And indulge me, there's a little quote I wanted to read. She sat cross-legged on the floor and opened the book. It was filled with illustrated panels. They had onion paper that you peeled away as you would a curtain on a window to get a view of what was going on outside, or that you pulled down like a sheet from the bed to see what body was lying underneath. I mean, O'Neill has complete mastery over metaphor and imagery as she writes this book. It was bittersweet, melancholy, and complex. It was a story full of witty character dialogue and mesmerizing descriptions. It's simultaneously heartbreaking and life-affirming, and it depicts the range of human experience through the eyes of a very charismatic hero and heroine through their life together. And from the margins of the Depression to high society. It's about ambition, perseverance, desperation, heartbreak, and the very large power of love. So that is The Lonely Hearts Hotel by Heather O'Neill. And I think Jackie's going to talk a little bit more about her Discovery Collection.
Speaking of weird, I feel like that word keeps coming up. The next book I want to talk about is called How to Be Human by Paula Kokoza. This is her first novel. She's a writer for The Guardian in the UK. The book takes place in London. And I chose this title in large part because it generated some of the most compelling reviews I've ever read. I strongly encourage you to read them on Goodreads if you have half an hour to kill. Readers seem to be equal parts uncomfortable and completely mesmerized. Virtually all of the reviewers agreed that she's a superb writer. The book is unique. It's completely original, but it's bizarre. So are you curious yet? So the story follows Mary, who is living in London, and she's recently gotten out of an abusive relationship. It's a long, hot summer. She's bored. She's uncomfortable, and she suddenly finds herself obsessed with a fox that she regularly sees in her garden, like a fox, like the animal fox.
On the ground
So
fox.
Miri praises the fox as one would an attractive person. She tells acquaintances she's seeing someone, all the while thinking smugly of her fox. The book is told partially from Mary's standpoint and partially from that of the fox. So this book is truly about different perspectives, which really is what the Discovery Collection is all about. So if you enjoy literary descriptive writing and are willing to take a chance on a new writer with a slightly strange premise, How to Be Human by Paula Kokoza might be worth a try.
It's intriguing.
It's intriguing. And now we are back to...
I think we're back to me.
To Karen.
Yeah.
So the next one I want to talk about is N.K. Jemisin's The Fifth Season, which I mentioned at the beginning. And there's a quote on the front of this book from Salon.com that says, one of the most celebrated new voices in epic fantasy on it. And she is, but that quote just makes me cringe because when I see the term epic fantasy, I know what it suggests to people who don't like fantasy or think they don't like fantasy. But like the rest of the books on this list, The Fifth Season kind of defies labels. And while it's true that you probably would have to start a description of it by saying that it was some mixture of sci-fi and fantasy, I don't want to lose you completely before I start, so I'm going to explain. If I had to guess, for those of you who don't like fantasy, I would say it's probably because you have no interest in elves and fairies and dragons and magic swords and trees with eyes, right? There's none of that here. Jemisin's worlds are they're familiar enough for us to relate to in structure and character, and at the same time they're kind of brand new and formed from her amazing imagination. All of her books do contain magic, whether it's the power of a god or in this case a superhuman. And that's the reason they get the fantasy label. But I would say that these books are just as closely related as something like Margaret Atwood's speculative fiction, books that take our world and sort of ask what if, as they are to anything that we would usually call epic fantasy. So, and for you science fiction naysayers, there are no spaceships, pretty much. There are no aliens or time travel or teleportation here either. The science that she uses to tell her stories is her geological knowledge about seismic shifts and tectonic plates and earthquakes that are constant threats in this world that is the setting, this continent that is the setting for the book called The Stillness, which is ironically named because it is a place where the earth never rests and where these catastrophic seismic events called Fifth Seasons, the name of the book, or just seasons for short, kind of rip up the land every few centuries, every few generations. And the Fifth Seasons tend to wipe out all but the hardiest of humans. And then because of that, they inform so much of daily life. There are moral codes and laws that are passed down through generations that help people to kind of figure out how to survive and live through the next season. Now, having said all of that, on a much more basic level, this is an incredibly human story about three women, or two women and a girl, whose lives are all mysteriously intertwined. I'll give you just a little taste of the plot. Essen, the first woman that we meet, finds that her son has been murdered and begins a journey to track down her daughter, who her husband has run away with. All of this happens as the catastrophes of the newest Fifth Season are starting to wreak havoc and be felt across the stillness. And at the same time, there's a more localized catastrophe, which, as it turns out, is turning Essen's village upside down. And it turns out, we find very, very quickly, that Essen is the reason for that catastrophe. So these series are all really good, all of the series of books that she's read, but this is by far and away the best. And the last in the trilogy is coming out in August. So if you hurry, you can read the first two before the next one comes out.
When you're talking about world building, I was thinking that one of the things for naysayers who don't like fiction or fantasy or science fiction is that a lot of times you need a lot of background material. Like it takes a long time to get the story started. How does she handle that?
Sometimes pages and chapters of who did this and what and why before you even get to the story. there's, again, none of that here in Jemison. I think her true genius is world building. She, the action and the characters start from the very first pages, and by page 50 or 100, you suddenly realize you're in this world and you don't even know how you got there, really. I mean, there is some terminology, there's some words that you have to learn along the way. She provides a glossary if you get stuck, but she just does it so seamlessly that you don't have to worry about any of that stuff, and you're just immediately immersed.
Makes it more accessible.
Yeah. Oh, totally. Yeah. Definitely action adventure from the start.
Good.
All right. Who's next?
I am.
Beth.
So my book follows very well on yours because it has a lot of the similar things. Like there's some world building, and there's, well, let me tell you what the book is first. The Sparrow by Mary Doria Russell. And she mixes literary fiction, science fiction, and speculative fiction, and all throughout it runs a deep philosophical question. So in that way, it's similar to yours too. In it, charismatic Father Sondes spurs a first contact mission to another planet in 2019 with